Most students don't struggle with research because they can't write, they struggle because they can't manage it. There is a lot more to research than just research itself, and if your research feels messy, slow, or overwhelming, it's probably not your ability that's the problem. So let me show you how I manage my scoping review across time, projects, and data, and what I've learned along the way. Hi there, I'm Dr. Kenyon Wong and I teach research at 2 UK universities and I support postgraduate students on their dissertations and theses through my business. In this video, I'm going to show you how I manage my scoping review from project and time management to handling data across multiple tools and what I wish I'd done differently. This is part of my video series on using AI in my scoping review. If you haven't watched the earlier videos, I would recommend starting from that. Managing a piece of research is just as important as doing the research itself. At this stage, whether you're doing a master's or a PhD, you're largely working independently. So you're not just responsible for conducting the study, but also for keeping track of everything that's happening within it. And management here, it's not just about time, it's about how you handle all of the moving pieces in your research. Now with a scoping review, one advantage is that the process is actually quite structured. It works almost like a sequence. You search, then deduplicate, then screen, then extract, and so on. So unlike empirical research, where you might be collecting and analyzing data at the same time, the challenge here isn't overlapping stages. The real challenge is managing information, decisions, and documents within each stage, especially when you're using multiple tools across the workflow. In this review, I was moving across different platforms for different purposes: searching, screening, extraction, and writing. And very quickly, this creates fragmentation. You have search histories in databases, screening decisions on one platform, PDF and notes in another, spreadsheets for extraction, and drafts in a separate space. Without a system, it becomes very easy to lose track of what you've done, where things are, and what your latest version is. What worked particularly well for me was a researcher's journal. In this journal, I documented my thought processes, my research decisions, changes to inclusion and exclusion criteria, discussions with other academics, and even where I stopped at the end of each session. This served two purposes. First, it created an audit trail, which is essential when you're writing up your methods and need to explain how your study was conducted. But more importantly, it acted as an anchor for the entire project. Because I wasn't working on this full time, I was often returning to the review after gaps, especially during busy teaching or marking periods. Without that record, I would have had to spend a lot of time trying to figure out where I left off, what decisions I've made, and what still needs to be done. The journal allowed me to pick up immediately and continue without duplicating work or creating confusion in my workflow. On one hand, it slowed me down in a very good way. It forced me to think more carefully and also be more deliberate with my decisions. But on the other hand, it wasn't always practical because it's not searchable. It was harder to locate specific information quickly. And since I travel and work across locations, I often had to take photos of my notes or duplicate them elsewhere, which then creates even more documents. Looking back, I think using a digital tool like Notion would have helped make the entire process a bit more streamlined, especially since I already use it in other areas of my work. Managing the workflow is one part of the challenge, but separate from it is managing everything the research actually produces. Because once you move through each stage of a scoping review, you very quickly accumulate a large volume of data and files. You're not just dealing with papers, you're dealing with PDF, notes, annotations, multiple versions of data extraction, and not to mention several drafts of your own writing. All of this is often spread across different tools and platforms. In my case, I had files and data sitting in multiple places, screening decisions, extracted data, notes on paper, and writing drafts, all existing separately. Without a proper system, this becomes very difficult to manage. Alongside that, I also kept everything stored in a cloud-based folder system. This meant that my documents were synced, accessible from different devices, and also consistently updated. This helped reduce issues like duplicated files, outdated versions, or losing track of the latest draft. Now, looking back, this is an area which I could have been more systematic from the start. If I were to do this again, I would create a much clearer structure for how the folders are organized, how the files are named, and how each stage of the review is separated and stored. Because when that structure isn't clear, small inefficiencies start to build up. You start spending more time looking for things, checking versions, and trying to make sense of your own data. One tool that worked really well for me is Zotero, especially for managing citations and keeping notes attached to each paper. However, it also introduced some challenges, particularly with duplicate records. At one point, I had multiple multiple versions of the same paper in my library labeled slightly differently, which then caused confusion during the writing stage. Another area where I created extra work for myself was data charting. I found that I was repeatedly organizing and reorganizing my extraction tables because I didn't have a clear idea of how I wanted to present the results. And this is something that I would strongly advise against. Your data extraction and charting should be guided by how you plan to present your results. If that isn't clear from the beginning, you end up reworking the data multiple times, which is both time consuming and very frustrating. So one key lesson here is that you need to think about your results section when you do your full text screening before you even begin charting your data. Because the way you organize your data during the extraction and the level of detail that you're extracting should directly support the way you intend to present it later. Time management in research isn't about how long things take. It's about understanding where your time actually goes and how to manage each stage of the process. So let me give you a quick overview of what the timeline of this entire scoping review actually looks like. It started with planning, refining the research question and strategy, then searching and exporting the papers, then screening, first titles and abstracts, and then full text. Then after that, data extraction and charting, and finally writing, editing, and refining the review. Now on paper, it looks really linear and straightforward, but in reality, each of these stages comes with very different time demands. Planning was slow but important. I spent about 5 full working days refining the research question, testing search strings, and adjusting inclusion-exclusion criteria. It feels slow at the time, but the investment made everything else more manageable later, because when I moved on to searching, I was able to complete it in a single day with a very clear and focused strategy. Searching was fast, but only because of the amount of planning that I did. And that's important because some stages of a review needed to be done more quickly and consistently. If you search different databases on different days, your results then become inconsistent as new research papers are being indexed. Screening on the surface is simple, but it's mentally exhausting. I screened around 691 papers, which took around 3 full days of work, but I had to spread this out over several weeks. You can't realistically screen hundreds of papers in one sitting without your decision-making quality dropping. Full text screening and data extraction were the most demanding. Full text screening alone took me around 10 days, especially because many of the papers were outside my immediate area of expertise. Data extraction took another 8 days, and this was probably the most cognitively demanding part of the process. It is very difficult to break this into small sessions because it requires sustained focus and consistency. Writing, interestingly, was not the most time-consuming part, but it was highly iterative. For example, the results section took around 5 days, not just to write, but to organize, refine, and repeatedly go back to the data. In total, the review took around 54 working days, around 400 hours, but in reality, it was closer to 600 to 700 because I had to redo parts of the review. And this is where I think there is a misconception about AI. AI doesn't remove the work, it changes the work. While it can help in certain stages, the overall time saved is actually quite limited. What it really does is improve rigor and provide another layer of checking, but not necessarily speed up the entire process. Publication for me was probably one of the most difficult parts of this entire process. My original intention with this review wasn't actually to publish it. It was to create teaching material for my students and for this channel. I wanted something that didn't just show the final paper, but also show full sets of work products so that I can properly demonstrate how a scoping review is being done in practice. Because in most published papers, you don't actually see that level of detail. The only real way to do this properly was to create the material myself. For me, publication was always a secondary goal. I submitted to 2 journals and both rejected it, but for completely different reasons. The first journal rejected the paper because it was outside their remit, but they in fact actually do publish scoping reviews because I checked it beforehand. The second rejected it because they wanted the review to push stronger arguments, which is something that a scoping review really isn't designed to do. And this highlights another important point. Publication isn't just about quality, it's about fit. Even if your work is methodically sound, it can still be rejected if it doesn't align with the journal's expectations or priorities. Beyond that, there were also structural challenges as well. As an independent researcher, publishing without an institutional affiliation is very difficult. I was also conducting this review as a sole researcher using AI, which introduces additional concerns around rigor and acceptance. And finally, there's an issue of funding. So there are many journals that require publication fees, which I did not have for this project. At a certain point, I had to make a decision with this review. I had already spent around 2 years working on the review, and my primary goal was to make it available as a teaching resource. So rather than continue trying to adapt it to fit journal requirements, which would very likely take me another year, I decided to self-publish it on my website for free for anyone to access. It's not perfect, and I would like to revisit it in the future, but it serves its purpose, and that for me was the priority. This leads to my final takeaway. Not all research needs to be published in a journal to be valuable. Its value depends on what you're trying to achieve with it. I've turned my PhD study into a master's level module. I've got clients who use their dissertations as leverage for a new job, push for policy changes, or create new workflows in their workplace. Publication is just one of the many ways to make use of research. This review turned out to be a much more intense and time-consuming project than I expected, but through this process I've learned a lot about the use of AI in research. One of my main observations is that the amount of time saved by AI is actually quite limited, for me at least. While it can speed up certain steps, the overall process is still very time-consuming, and in many cases the role of AI is less about saving time and more about improving rigor, helping you check your work, refine your thinking, and catch your mistakes. At the same time, AI changes the experience of doing research. There is value in struggling through the process, reading, writing, and working through the problems yourself, and to some extent, AI can reduce that. So while it can be helpful, there's a trade-off in terms of how deeply you engage with the research process. I also have some reservations, particularly around uploading original material and potential implications for intellectual property or publication. At the same time, AI has allowed me to do things that would have been very difficult otherwise, such as having a form of second reviewer to challenge my work. So there are clear benefits, but also real risks. And ultimately, this comes down to how the tool is being used. It is very difficult for institutions to fully regulate AI use in practice. So a large part of this responsibility falls on the individual researcher. Where do you draw the line? What do you choose to do or not do using AI? All of these become a matter of personal and academic integrity. Now, this brings me to the end of the series on using AI in my scoping review. I've kept this series rather general so that it applies to your research, but if you like a full walkthrough of my actual review, how I wrote it, structured it, developed the arguments, let me know in the comments and I may do a separate video on that. The full paper is linked in the description below again if you want to explore the methods and research in more detail. If you're watching this, you'll probably find my earlier video on whether or not you can use AI in your research at your university really helpful, especially if you're considering it yourself. And if there are other topics you'd like me to cover, let me know in the comments as well. I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.